Les Misérables follows a day in the life of three cops as they patrol a dangerous Paris slum. The day turns to chaos that eventually leads to a deadly showdown between the police and the inhabitants of the slum, and we don't know who is going to survive. Les Misérables won a jury prize at the Cannes International Film Festival back in 2019. The film is directed by Ladj Ly. And the film stars Damien Bernard, Alexis Meninetti, Jabril Zonga, and Isa Parika, amongst a whole host of other people. There are a lot of characters in this film. Speaking of characters, thank you very much for joining me for this film discussion on Les Misérables. My name is TJ, and this is Cinemateq. And at Cinemateq, we just love talking about movies, whether that's the film news, new releases, classic films, all the news. We just love discussing them. So the whole point of this particular video, we're just going to talk about Les Misérables. There's going to be spoilers. Spoilers are necessary for discussion. So if you don't want to have Les Misérables spoiled for you, just go away. Go watch a review of it or go see the film. It's nominated for an Academy Award for Best International Film, so it hopefully isn't hard for you to find. And once you do see it, come on back, listen to what I have to say, and let's talk about the film. Let's discuss it in the comments below. And as always, it would mean so much to me if you were to subscribe to this channel and to hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of the film discussions that we have. I'm also not working with a monitor right now, so I have no idea if my cat is in frame right now. But if he is, feel free to stare at him for the entire video. And if he's not, well, then you can just use your imagination. And when I'm talking and just going like this, I'm petting him. I'm not doing a weird thing. There is a cat here. So let's start this discussion about Les Misérables at its logical starting point, and that is the name. Why, oh why, is this crime film, this modern day crime film, called Les Misérables? Why is it named after Victor Hugo's book of the same name that came out in the late 1800s, I'm going to say, 1870s? I'll put the actual year here. First, I want to note that Les Misérables, the film, is not a modern day adaptation of the original novel. There are many profound differences between the two. So we should think of it more as a thematic adaptation, I think, more so than any kind of straight adaptation, although there are references to the original novel in the film. For one, I think the character of Chris, the asshole cop who just does whatever he wants, yeah, he's pretty much a stand-in for Javert. He's got that unyielding sense of having to do his duty. He just takes it to very corrupt ends. And then we have new guy cop, Ruiz. He could be a stand-in for Jean Valjean, especially since his whole reason for being in this unit that is patrolling this slum is so that he can be closer to his child, and Jean Valjean is a character who is very much associated with caring for children. Victor Hugo himself is mentioned in the film as well. I believe there is a high school or some sort of building in the slum that they patrol that is named after Victor Hugo, and there is a particular sequence in the film where Chris actually starts naming off characters from the film and updating them for the slum that they are patrolling. I can't really get into it because a lot of it is just not in my memory right now, but when you're watching the film, it's fairly early on and it's fairly obvious. Pay attention, there's some interesting stuff there. One of the main points of differentiation between the novel and the film is that the novel is an epic. It takes place over a couple of decades, whereas the film takes place in one day, well, 1.5 days. However, there are similarities in the ways that the story gets weaved together. Both feature several different characters operating in their own storylines, which occasionally cross with each other. In Les Misérables, it's more concentrated because we are looking at one very specific day for three cops, and the things going on around them involve them to a certain degree, or at least are happening because of them. So it's more concentrated, yes, but we do have several scenes that don't feature the cops. We see the perspectives of many different characters throughout the film, and that, I think, is a similarity that we can draw between both the novel and the film. So everything I just discussed is pretty surface level. It's interesting that those comparisons can be made, but it doesn't really tell us anything about what the film is trying to do, what its intention is. And there is one thing in particular, one similarity that I haven't touched on yet that I think really tells us all we need to know, and that is the similarity between the June Rebellion that happens in Les Misérables, the book, and the rebellion of the slum inhabitants that happens at the end of the film. The climax of Victor Hugo's Les Misérables is the 1832 June Rebellion, where French Republicans rose up against the entrenched monarchy. The climax of Les Misérables, the 2019 film, culminates with the inhabitants of the slums rising up against all those who oppress them, which is cops, which is gangs, which is a whole host of people who are just grinding the inhabitants of this slum underfoot. And so for this reason alone, we can draw a fairly interesting comparison between the two. Both films feature people rising up against entrenched power. And while it might be easy to say that this is just another surface level similarity, I think that once you put it in a modern context, what the director is essentially rallying for, it becomes much more than that. The climax of Les Misérables, the book, draped on modern French society, is actually a very powerful message. The director is in essence saying that in order to free ourselves of the constant struggles and the oppression upon which the people of France face, they have to push back against those systems that exist in society that oppress them in the first place. It's also no accident that the director specifically chose Les Misérables as the title / inspiration for this film. As I said, it is considered a classic. I think depending on the book list you look at, it's often in the top 10 of books published ever. And so the people of France would be able to look at a film like Les Misérables and see those connections and understand where the director is coming from when presenting these images and these themes. It's also noteworthy that this film is set in the aftermath of France's 2018 World Cup victory. Speaking as someone who recently had a championship happen in our city, go Raptors, I can tell you that when that happens, there is a feeling of supreme unity throughout a city, and in the case of France, throughout a country. When you look at people, you no longer see the divisions that existed before. All you see is a unified people who are just so happy that their team won a championship. And by setting Les Misérables in the aftermath of the World Cup, I think it actually is meant to critique how fleeting that feeling of unity actually is. And I admire the director for using that as the first step of the journey as we go from witnessing the corruption of power and how that affects the inhabitants to the inhabitants actually starting to fight back against that corruption and against that oppression. If occasionally you can hear weird stuff in the background, this is my cat playing with a toy, I think. Yeah, he's having fun. I'm just going to leave him alone. Moving on, I want to touch on something that I've been seeing a lot in the film circles of YouTube and on Twitter and whatnot, where people are very, very obsessed with character arcs and that characters must have an arc, a satisfying arc, in order for the film to be good. And this is something that I think Les Misérables pushes back against, although not purposely. It just happens to be a function of its creation. Les Misérables takes place over a day and a half, and we begin with the characters in a very specific part of their lives, and when we get to the end of the film, or at least just before the climax, those characters are in almost the exact same position. They, for the most part, have not changed morally, they have not changed their philosophy about life, they have not learned a lesson, and they have not become new and different people. You could make the argument that the character of Ruiz, who starts off as a fresh-faced cop, fresh on the beat, doesn't really know what's going on, tries to stand up to Chris when Chris does things that are blatantly illegal and a cop should not be doing, but then by the end of it, Ruiz just falls in with them and accepts this as part of his life. You could argue that that is a character arc, although I don't know what would be the point of considering as such when you have someone who just decides to go along with the group, with the crowd, and to be part of that oppression that is keeping the citizens down. I don't really see that as being a character progression as much as it is an indictment of how a system can swallow someone up. I don't think Ruiz really made these choices of his own volition, but instead saw that he was in an impossible situation and just accepted it and decided not to push back against it anymore. So to that point, when it comes to talking about films and having character arcs as being considered a necessary thing for a film to be good, or that the character arcs must be satisfying for a film to be good, I want to start pushing back on that notion. I feel like films can have very little character arc within them, but still do exactly what they meant to and still be utterly satisfying. And I think that this notion that characters must have arcs is a bit too rigid and applies too squarely to a kind of Hollywood cinema where you have your 1, 2, 3 act structure where characters go on their hero's journey and end in a particular place and they are changed after a certain amount of time. That might work for the more fantastical films, for the films coming out of Disney and out of Hollywood as a whole, but for the smaller independent films and international films which are not beholden to the Hollywood model, we shouldn't be using that same kind of rhetoric in order to judge these films. Now I want to talk about the ending of the film, specifically like the last couple of shots of the film. So if you've been thinking, hey, he hasn't really been spoiling too much so far, just some general vague things, get ready for all the spoilers. The last couple of minutes of the film, we're doing the whole thing. The film ends with Issa, a child who was terrorized by these 3 cops, was shot in the face by what they call a flashball, I believe. He is holding a Molotov cocktail, and he is about to just throw it at these 3 cops who are cornered in a building that they cannot escape from. But Ruiz, the new guy who I was talking about, and who at this point has basically fallen in with the cops and accepted his position as being a somewhat corrupt figure, is pointing his gun at Issa, and the essential look in their eyes and the question that they're asking each other is are we going to survive this? Because if you throw your cocktail, I'm going to shoot you. And I'm sure Issa also has in his mind that if you shoot me, you're damn sure I'm going to throw this cocktail. What we are essentially left with is what appears to be an open ending. You see these 2 people staring at each other, the film then fades to black, and then we get a quote which I'm going to bring up in a minute, but I first want to talk about just the ending itself before that quote happens. And I think because we get a fade to black and we don't get the resolution of the action, the Molotov cocktail is not thrown and the gun is not fired, it would be easy to look at this ending and call it open-ended. We don't really know what's going to happen, we don't know how the story of the film actually ends, but I think we do. And I think it's very telling in the way that the film presents this ending. Because whether or not Issa throws the Molotov cocktail or not, and whether or not Ruiz shoots Issa or not, the fate of the slum is pretty much sealed at this point. The police are going to come in, the inhabitants are going to push back harder against the police, and it's going to escalate further and further into riots. This is a reckoning that has been brought on by the systematic oppression of the people who live in the slums, by both the police and the gangs who live there. And so now all of this anger and resentment that was building up underneath is bubbling up to the surface, and this is the flashpoint. This is the explosion. So really, the individual actions of Issa and Ruiz in this instant don't really matter when you take a look at the broad perspective that the film is taking. Yes, it looks at these very individual characters, but as I was saying before, as it's pulling in things from Les Misérables, the novel, and it's trying to give us a larger sense of French culture in doing so, I think it's safe to say that this film is not so much about one slum or a cop and a kid, but about the entire social situation that is going on in France right now, talking about inequality, talking about people being forced to live in slums, and the whatnot. And the ending of this film is insinuating that France is a powder keg, and when that fuse is lit, there won't be any stopping it. It's just going to tear itself apart. And maybe because of the allusions that the film makes to Victor Hugo's novel, this could be seen as a positive step, or at least one that will lead the French people to a better society. However, I also understand that that is a very specific take, and because the end of the film, even though I don't think is open-ended, could be conceived and construed in a few different ways, I would love to hear what you thought about it in the comments below. And if you have anything specifically to say about what I said, please criticize me, critique me all you want. I love to hear different ideas and different opinions about what I'm talking about. And so I just want to finish with the quote that actually comes at the end of the film, and that is, and I quote, "Remember this, my friends, there are no such things as bad plants or bad men, there are only bad cultivators." And I thought this was an interesting quote to use at the end of the film. Remember, we end with Issa holding a Molotov cocktail and Ruiz holding a gun, and they are ready to kill each other, but as I just discussed, I feel like that isn't really the point of the end of the film. And if I'm reading this quote correctly and interpreting it correctly, the director is saying that there are only bad cultivators. And I think what we then have to decide is, well, who is a cultivator in the context of this film? You could argue that the cops are just doing what the cops have to do. And even though they've been doing it for a long, long time, can we really consider them to be the cultivators of everything that goes wrong in this film? Or is the cultivators in the context of this quote talking more openly about the society in which the cops are forced to inhabit and forced to police? And for me, I feel like the cops are the cultivators and they are part of that larger system. An entire societal array of decision makers and policy makers and those who enforce those decisions have led the slums to exist as they do now, which then forces the people in them to live in a particular way, a particular fashion. And so obviously the point of saying that there are no bad plants, no bad men, that is in reference to the people who live in the slum. And I think the bad cultivators are really anyone above that. Anyone who sees a situation, thinks of a way to make it best for themselves while stamping down and suppressing the rights of others and oppressing people to a degree that makes their lives utterly horrible. As such, and it doesn't really even matter if I'm right in this kind of context, but if that is what the director is going for, then I think he basically hit the nail on the head, which is one of the reasons why I think this film is absolutely worth watching and why I think it's one of the better films that came out in 2019. And that is it for me. I think I've basically touched on everything that I wanted to discuss with you. And with that said, please let me know what you thought about the film in the comments below and what you thought about this video in the comments below. Did you agree with what I had to say? Did you not? And tell me why. Please also make sure to subscribe to this channel. As I said, I love it when you do that. Hit the notification bell. I live stream every Sunday talking about the week's film news or doing a live stream of whatever award ceremony is going on, of which there are many going on this time of year, and I wouldn't want you to miss any of that, so hitting the notification bell is how you stay in the loop. Thank you so much again for watching this video. My name is TJ, this is Cinemateq, and I will see you in the next video.